Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, to those who attend from the continent and the UK, and good morning to the ones from the My name is Zafirios Rosidis, and I will be the host of today's conference. Celebrating the Greek National Day, the head of the Permanent Mission of Greece at the UN offices in Geneva, Ambassador Panagiotis Tournaras, has invited all of you to this event. We'll have the privilege to listen to 4 distinguished speakers. They all have excelled not only at their specific academic fields, but at public speaking and at government counseling as well. Moreover, another common denominator is their unconditional love and dedication to Greece and its people. All 4 of them will take us on a charming voyage that started a few millennia ago, and it's still in progress. They will explain the ups and downs of the Greek nation, its triumphs and disasters, its friends and foes, and through all this, we'll have the chance to think of the future, the challenges and the opportunities to come. His Excellency, Ambassador Tournaras, will open the conference. Your Excellency.
Thank you, Zafiris. And welcome everyone on this special day. Thank you very much for joining us. In the next hour, as Zafiris very eloquently said, we will hear from distinguished scholars. They will take us to an interesting voyage spanning centuries, as is the history of the Greek nation, maritime and trade nation that gave birth to democracy and the Olympic ideal that has found its rightful place among the other nations in the world, that is also striving for peace, security, and good relations with all around the globe. This is a special day for us also because we don't want to just concentrate on our legacy, on our past. As Zafiris said, we are also like to demonstrate our vision, how Greece sees the future. So it is really important to see how we are going to take the next steps in this interesting and never-ending voyage. You know that it took a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of struggle to get Greece to where we are now, a proud member of the European family, enjoying excellent relations with almost all the countries in the world, and a proud also member of a great number of international organizations. We intend to keep that. And the people and all our friends I think, are with us on that. Ancient Greek philosophers used to say that brevity is the essence of wit, so I just take their advice and stop here. And I wish you a very successful conference, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you, and back to you, Zafiris.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Professor Hanson is a living legend, not only because of his teaching capabilities, his academic excellence, his insightful research, or his winemaking skills, but mostly because he knows who killed Homer. Professor Hanson, apart from everything you can read in his bio, he is a huge Philhellean who has repeatedly proved his dedication to Greece in a very active manner. Professor Hanson, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll try to speak for 20 minutes, and I'd like to just give a 5 to 8 minute, if that's possible, rundown of 2,500 years of history that might explain the Greek ambiguity as it looks east and west, and its present challenges and successes in the lenses of the past. Remember that it's a very strange place because it's 50,000 square miles, ancient Greece. It only has about 1.5 to 3 million people. And it's located in both a very advantageous and disadvantageous place. It has a 500 miles and you're in Alexandria, Egypt, and in the pre-city-state period, there was a lot of fertilization from the pharaohs, from not only Minoans, but later Mycenaeans. It's 300 or 400 miles from the Asia Minor hinterland, the Hittite Empire, Troy, etc. So it was pre-city-state Greece, got a lot of advantages, but I don't know what happened. I wrote a book about what happened, the other Greeks. In the 8th century, there was a revolution in Greece. And out of nowhere, so to speak, 1,500 city-states appeared. And I think it would not be an exaggeration to say that most of our Western menu today had no pedigree prior to those city-states. They're antithetical to Mediterranean civilization in general, and even to prior Greek-speaking Mycenaean. And I'm talking about the polis and its embrace of private property, free speech, constitutional government, rationalism, the idea you explain natural phenomenon through reason rather than just superstition. It had a very tense but successful relationship between religious faith and the powers of reasons, etc. And out of that gave Greece a power, a leverage, an influence that was not commensurate with its small population, partly because of science, partly because of the freedom of the Greeks, but it was manifested in superior technology, superior military arts. And we see that first challenge at Marathon in 490, and then the great invasion of Xerxes, which until D-Day was the largest amphibious invasion in history. And it was repulsed both at Salamis, at the Battle of Plataea. And then we have the classical period, and that legacy is passed on to Alexander, who in some sense warps it by suppressing the constitutional element within the Greek experience, but uses it to go all the way to India. And we have not just Hellenism, but what we call in the West Hellenistic, Greek-like civilization that is now surrounding not just the Aegean, but the Mediterranean and all the way to the Persian Gulf. Greece then looks eastward, but at the same time that this has been occurring, there have been Greek colonists all the way to Sicily and southern Italy. And indeed, if George Boussault's right, the word Graea, a small colony in Western Greece that sent settlers to Cumae, that was the word that the Romans used for Hellenes. But the Romans looked at Greece and conquered Greece in 146, but they were conquered by Greeks because they took the elements of consensual government and created a federated system, and this word in Latin that has no counterpart in Greek, natio. And they were able to combine individual city-states in a manner that Greece only loosely could with federations. And the result was the dynamism that incorporated Greek ideals, but added a practicality and pragmatism to it. Okay, so for 500 years, Greece is the intellectual center of Rome and the custodian of its ideas and the accelerant of Roman culture. But as the empire in the West starts to fade and the locus of power, influence, and wealth comes eastward, Greece starts to have a more predominant role. And when the empire in the West collapses in the 5th century, late 5th century AD, the Byzantines, or that is, they're called Romans, but they're Greek-speaking Byzantines, they will last for 1,000 years. And they do it by avoiding the religious schisms that were common in the West. They have an Orthodox religion that unites people. They were able to combine Greek-speaking people of all different ethnic backgrounds. And the result is, it reaches its apex perhaps as early as the 6th century with Justinian, Hagia Sophia, the Justinian law code, and the first manifestation of what I'd call the great idea, the megale idea, where if it had not been for the plague of Justinian, you could argue, as Edward Luttwak did, that Justinian's idea of reuniting the entire Roman Empire would have been successful. So at that point, Greece is in a not just an influential position, but the predominant position in the ancient world. But it's got this same problem that while it is protected from Europe by a mountain range, it's also cut off from Europe. And while it has fertilization avenues to Asia and Egypt, those are also routes of invasion. And as for the next 1,000 years, it will be buffeted by challenges in the East from the Parthians, the Persians, and especially in the 7th century from Islam. And Black Tuesday, 1453, we'll see the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, and then the tragic loss of Mistra 8 years later. And at that point, Greece for 400 years will be ostensibly an Ottoman colony, but unlike many other colonies or subject states of the Ottomans, it will retain its language, its religion, and it will be free in the 19th century. And so what I'm getting at here is, in the Greek experience, and indeed the entire Balkan experience, if you look at this history, they feel that they were, on the one hand, the fertilizers of Western Europe, whose ideas, culture, language were borrowed or adopted or modified or improved, etc., from Greece. And yet Greece proved itself to be the bulwark, whether it was the Byzantine Empire or whether it was the Balkan resistance. And out of that garrison mentality, they did not experiment with religious diversity in the sense of Catholicism, Protestantism, the Reformation. They had no margin of error, so to speak. Orthodox religion didn't. And I think today, when we look at this ambiguity of having friends in the West and challenges in the East, it explains a lot of the things that are otherwise inexplicable. So Greece, after World War I, and as a participant that suffered a great deal, and under Venizelos, they had the beginning of the great idea. They were prepared to recreate portions of the Byzantine Empire until you could make the argument that David Lloyd George saw the Young Turks and thought there was opportunities there, and the Greeks were stopped and there was supplies cut off, and that failed. In World War II, I was in Greece once, and I met a German soldier who told me that at the siege of Sebastopol in 1942 under von Manstein, one of the nice things about destroying that Russian city was eating Greek canned peaches. And that he explained to me that most of the food in Greece in 1940, 41, 42 was supplying army groups south as it went all the way to near the Caspian. And yet, when you look at that role, right afterwards, Greek becomes the battleground between East and West again, between communist forces coming from Yugoslavia and the West. And a lot of the times, its friends did not quite understand Greeks. They were friendly, but they had different interests, sometimes in Western Europe and the United States, given their precarious history and position. And that ambiguity is predominant today. I was looking as we look at the Ukrainian war, the United States, and I think a lot of us are zealous supporters of Mr. Zelensky. We want him to succeed. We're shocked at Mr. Putin. But that said, Greece has to be very careful because it relies on Russian oil and natural gas. And when it looks for Western support, it's a little bit ambiguous. We in the United States canceled all the sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And until the invasion of Ukraine, we were quite willing for Germany to import oil from Russia, but we jawboned and helped cancel, or at least to suspend, the Greece-Cypriot-Israel pipeline. And if you think of it in abstract terms, we in the West were essentially saying to Greece, you're our allies, but we don't believe your pipeline is compatible with climate change concerns. But Russia is our nominal adversary or opponent or rival, but we feel it's okay for you to send natural gas. And when we look at NATO, for example, the two largest countries in NATO one is Turkey with 85 million people, and by population it's the largest, and by the size of its army it's the largest. Germany is 81 million, and by the size of its economy it's the largest. But when you look at the Pew polls that calibrate popularity, it turns out that the most anti-American country in NATO is Turkey. About 65% have a negative view of the United States, and Germany has 55% in a recent poll said they were more eager for closer relations with Russia than with the United States. And yet when you look at Greece, Even after our tumultuous history with the United States with Cyprus and the dictatorship, Greeks overwhelmingly express positive views now of the United States. So here you have a NATO power that's firmly within the Western European camp, and it's a bulwark against enemies, so to speak, of the West, and yet we have this problem in the United States, because this historical problem, because it's a frontline garrison state. It's in the East. We're not as pro-Greek as we can, and Greece itself has to be realistic with its relations with Turkey and with its relations with Russia, not just because of its vulnerable history and topography, geography, but because the West has a tendency across time and space to pledge fealty and support and encouragement, often in romantic terms, often condescending, but in periods of in extremis or existential challenges, the West then sort of reverts back to its realist concerns and starts to judge enemies or friends or both by the size of their population or the size of their military or the size of their economy. And often Greece is the victim of that. I'd like to finish, because I want to keep within the 20-minute line, by saying that if you look at the historical challenges of Greece and its geography in the modern period, there is no explanation for why it is so successful. After all, in the 15th century, when the New World woke up, countries that had been backward in classical antiquity, I'm talking about France, Gaul, or Britannia, or Britain, or Netherlands, or Spain, they all had Western ports. And they were able to discover the New World in part to get around to India and China because of the threat of the Ottomans and the impairment of trade routes. Countries that were in the Mediterranean were too far away from Gibraltar to get out into the Atlantic, and they, in a very conservative reactionary fashion, especially countries like the Venetian city-states or the Papal States, or Florence, etc., they kept a continuous of galley warfare. They never developed the nautical technology to take advantage of maritime transport or trade. And more importantly, they were always, as we know from Lepanto, they were always buffeted by the dangers which they felt they kept away from Western Europe. So it's that ambiguity that I think is central to understanding Greek concerns, that they are a Western European country that in some ways is the font of Western civilization, but they are placed in a position that makes it very, very dangerous for them to count on complete support from the West, even though it's essential to their survival because of their experience with a long historical record. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions if there is any.
Thank you very much, Professor Hanson. Regarding the questions, our attendees will submit them in writing. So we'll have if we have any questions at the end. But as far as I know, you will have some obligations, some engagement. You need to leave early, so it's quite a pity. But before I welcome Professor Hatzivassiliou, I want to welcome Professor Strauss, who joined us a few minutes ago. Hi, Barry. So Professor Evanthis Hatzivassiliou is probably the most prominent historian of his generation. He's a talented teacher, a skilled author, and he has a deep sense of duty towards Greece, something that is proved by his public service. Most people are impressed by his books on the Cyprus issue or the Cold War era. But if you ask me, I particularly love his study on the representations of Greco-Roman antiquity in the TV series Star Trek. Professor Hatzivassiliou, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zafiri. My thanks to the ambassador for this opportunity to take part in this event together with such distinguished intellectuals. I'm going to speak about the strange, difficult relation between modern Greece, its worldview, the world, and the relation to the past. In fact, there is a general pattern in modern Greek history. Since the late 18th century, the Greek world set out to fulfill a very difficult task, namely to detach itself from the space of underdevelopment and to join the developed world, what the Greeks were then called the enlightened West. The phrase they were using was "hypephotismeni esperia." This meant that the Greeks hoped to set up a modern nation state taking on board the models of governance of Europe, although recent research has pointed out that the American Constitution was also one of the models of political organization during the Greek War of Independence in the 1820s. The Declaration of Greek Independence, it was issued by the First National Assembly at Epidaurus in January 1822. This declaration strongly rejected the Ottoman tyranny and despotism, within quotes, and these are phrases from the declaration, and included clear references to what in our days is defined as the rule of law. The motive for rebelling, according to the Declaration of Greek Independence, was telling, quote, starting from these principles of natural law and aiming to equate ourselves with the rest of our colleagues, European Christians, we started the war against the Turks. So the Declaration of Greek Independence says it very plainly. We started the revolution in order to become Europe. Now, this trend to use models of the enlightened West is not surprising. The modern Greek world was a small nation. Unlike ancient Greece or Byzantium, modern Greece is not one of the major powers of the international system. It's not a regime maker, it's a regime taker. And it consistently looked to Europe for the main principles of its organization. And by the end of the 19th century, British parliamentarism had emerged as the main ideal that the Greek political system aimed to follow. Now, there were some problems in this endeavor. First of all, on the intellectual level, the Greeks were conscious of their relation to the Greece of antiquity, one of the intellectual bases of the West, or in modern parlance, the cradle of democracy. Now, a glorious past against the present of underdevelopment, even sometimes of misery. This created a kind of schizophrenia in modern Greeks. The relation to the past was perhaps handy as a tool of public diplomacy and as an appeal for Western aid or help in difficult circumstances, but it also inevitably made modern Greeks to appear in their own eyes as the unworthy successors of glorious ancestors. The prominent liberal intellectual Yorgos Theotokos described this in the 1930s as the feeling of being a kind of nouveau pauvre. Second, there was the problem of Greece's huge geopolitical weakness. Modern Greece consistently saw, and to some extent still sees, its relations with the West as a means to offset the huge geopolitical pressures of its region, the Balkans and the Eastern Mediterranean, one of the most troubled places in the world. I mean, in our wider region, today we have a war in the Ukraine. The Greek War of Independence came to a successful conclusion, not only because of the persistence of the Greek rebels, but also because, perhaps mostly because, of the fleets of the great powers, Britain, France, and Russia, destroyed the Turkish-Egyptian fleet in the Battle of Navarino in 1827. During the First and the Second World Wars, Greece lost territories which it only recovered because it found itself in the winning side in these world wars. In the Cold War, it was a small bridgehead in Eastern Europe, dominated by the Eastern Bloc. The Greek land borders in the north of the country were 40 kilometers deep, and north of them, until the Baltic, was the vast lands dominated by the Soviets. It was clear that Greece could survive as an independent country and as a member of the West only thanks to the support of the major Western powers, mostly the United States. In 1954, the same intellectual, Yorgos Theotokos, that I mentioned before, wondered in one of his articles in the press, quote, would it be possible to hold, even for 25 hours, the freedom, the culture, the national existence of Hellenism, if we could not see in our horizon the silent shapes of the military forces of America and Britain? Can Greece exist without the Anglo-American allies that contemporary history gave to it? And can we plan any policy, internal or foreign, without a full understanding of history in the making? Unquote. Now, these, on the other hand, had an unfortunate consequence in modern Greek political culture. Often many Greeks saw their nation and their country as the innocent bystander who was destined to suffer the interdictions of the great powers. The theory of dependence, so popular in the Western world in the 1960s, 1970s, was and perhaps still is one of the dominant ideas in Greece. This understanding was, of course, an exaggeration. Research has shown that there were indeed some cases of foreign power interventions in the history of Greece, but it is not accurate to blame the great powers for everything. More often than not, the causes of Greek failures, misfortunes, or tragedies are internal. They are not imposed from outside. Prominent scholars such as Nikiforos Diamandouros and James Miller have pointed to this Greek underdog mentality, which often is an impediment for the progress of the country. And then there was the problem of underdevelopment. This was, I think, the major problem in modern Greek history. The Greek state was willing to take on board Western models of governance. Even more, it liked to be at the forefront in the adoption of liberal constitutions. It was at the front, in the forefront. It adopted liberal constitutions, very advanced, very progressive, in 1844, 1864, 1911, 1927. However, there was a painful divergence between the forward-looking concepts and the social and economic realities of a small state emerging in a poor and underdeveloped region and hosted a fragmented Balkan society. Underdevelopment meant that the implementation of these liberal constitutions, of these forward-looking ideas, well, the implementation left much to be desired. Electoral fraud, for example, from 1843 to 1860 was rife. Bankruptcies occurred quite often, dealing the death blow, in fact, to modernizing policies in 1893 or in 1932. In 1932, the bankruptcy meant the death blow to the policies of Eleftherios Venizelos himself. During the first century of Greek independence, much was done in terms of modernization, but the country still remained underdeveloped, a small state of the periphery. During the 19th century and well into the 20th, Greece was perceived by the other Europeans as being a part of the Near East rather than a part of Europe. When King George I of the Greeks came to the country to assume his throne, 1864, he declared that his aim was to build, quote, a model state in the East, unquote, namely a modern European nation state in a region in which this would not be normally expected, which was not really Europe proper. And the French called their army fighting Greek Macedonia during the First World War, l'Armée d'Orient. Even in the 1940s, the US State Department Bureau dealing with Greece, Turkey, and Iran was the NEA, Near Eastern Affairs. It was not part of the European Bureau. The peak of Greece's misfortune was the 3 decades from the early 1920s to the late 1940s. The defeat of the Greek army by Kemalist Turkey in 1922 meant that almost 1.3 million refugees from Asia Minor came to a country of 4 million, bankrupt and devastated. Many of the refugees died after coming to Greece from famine or diseases. The country was unable to sustain them. State bankruptcy in 1932 during the Great Depression added to this devastation. Then the political system collapsed and the dictatorship under Ioannis Metaxas was imposed, 1936. During the 1940s, in fact, all conceivable evils fell on Greece short of the permanent loss of national territory. Greece repulsed the Italian attack in late 1940, but fell to the German attack in spring 1941. Then followed 3.5 years of triple occupation, German, Italian, and Bulgarian. Famine in the great cities, which claimed thousands of lives. Hyperinflation because of the looting of its economy by the occupying forces. And then civil war, which turned the country into the first hot battlefield of the Cold War. Dependence peaked at that time, when the state was weak, economically devastating, and was facing a vicious internal conflict, while at the same time feeling to be the target of a coordinated pressure, or if not outright aggression, by the Soviet bloc. By the second half of the 1940s, the Americans were making many of the important decisions simply because the Greek state was too destabilized to implement its own policies. Greece in the late 1940s resembled closely the image of a failed state in our times. So until the 1940s, Greece's relation with Europe or the West effectively meant the European great powers or the United States. This relationship was shaped by power balances and the crude realities of underdevelopment. Greece was a Western sphere of influence. It was not a full member of the West. And then it was a radically different story after the end of the 1940s. In the post-war period, two parallel and interactive changes made the difference. First, after 1953, Greece found the path to economic development. During the 1950s and 60s, Greece was among the most rapidly growing economies of the globe. This did not mean that it became a rich country. After all, the starting point was very low, but it managed at last to overcome the problem of underdevelopment and start the long uphill struggle to growth, mostly under the leadership of a new wave of modernization, the governments of Konstantinos Karamanlis. This economic development was the basis for everything else. I mean, in fact, one of the greatest of the West's intellectuals, William McNeill, he noted that this development signaled the, quote, metamorphosis of Greece after the Second World War. But at the same time, huge changes were occurring in the international system as well. The beginning of the Cold War led to a more participatory international system. In the new era of the Cold War, the two superpowers needed the active support of the minor partners rather than their mere submission. The new Western leader, the United States, favored the creation of an institutionally organized West based on multilateral agreements and organizations, the World Bank, the Marshall Plan, the European Recovery Program, the Organization of European Economic Cooperation, NATO, and others. Greece immediately took advantage of it and became a member of these organizations, joining NATO in 1952 together with Turkey. It was the first time in its history that Greece acquired a formal alliance with the great powers of the West. And in the 1950s, another change occurred with the emergence of the movement of European integration. Athens, experiencing its own rapid economic growth, immediately turned its attention to the new European institutions, and Greece became the first associated member of the EEC in 1961 and the full member in 1981. Well, the first European communities was a difficult thing for Greece. I mean, the European coal and steel community was a union of industrialized, advanced economies. But the creation of the European Economic Community in 1957 made the whole of was a landmark. This was a common market in which even poorer European states could participate. It included policies on agriculture. And the Karamanlis government, since the very start, since the creation of the EEC, 1957, opted for the EEC, not for other schemes of European cooperation, not for intergovernmental, but for the supranational project. And Greek economic development made it possible for the country to raise its sights and seek association with the EEC. It was also clear, however, that participation in the EEC would boost the country's economic prospects. The equation worked both ways. And the Minister for Economic Coordination, Panagis Papaligouras, one of the greatest intellectuals and politicians in Greek political history, during the parliamentary debate for the ratification of the Treaty of Association with the EEC, noted that the full modernization of the Greek economy could not be fully achieved within the narrow confines of the small Greek internal market. To secure its growth, Greece should become an integral part of the much larger community. Of course, another major aspect of the Greek decision to join the EEC lay elsewhere as well. Association with and then accession to the European communities would materialize one of the dreams of modern Greece, the formal full entry in Europe and the West. This was the prime aim that had eluded the Greek state until then. It was a decision involving the long-term prospects of the country. of course, it would also stabilize Greece's liberal parliamentary political regime. On their part, we need to make this point. The communities and the Western European national leaderships clearly showed that they were eager to play this role, to use community or European Union processes to stabilize the Greek state within Europe and within the West. This is not to say that all was well or is well after accession, and we all know that there is no such thing as a happy ending in history. Since accession, 1981, the country's role as a full member of the Union has paid off. EC membership became the field of a crucial convergence and consensus of the major Greek political forces from the early 1980s until at least the breakup of the recent economic crisis in 2010s. Since 1974, Greece has enjoyed the best democratic regime that in its modern history, and this was obviously connected with participation in the European Union. The country became the recipient of huge amounts of aid, although the wisdom with which it used them can be disputed. The acquis communautaire provided for an automatic mechanism of adjustment to the new trends in European governance, although again, it must be said that this cannot substitute for the necessary reformist initiatives from within, which is not always very satisfactory. So the European Union could not make up for the reformist immobilism that plagued the Greek Third Republic from the 1980s until the 2010s, and this is why we had the crisis. Now, the dangers of this stagnation became clear for all to see during the recent Greek economic crisis, when the consensus regarding Europe and the West almost broke. And in 2015, Greece came within a hair's breadth from an inglorious and devastating exit from Europe. Still, during this crisis, the European Union acted as a safeguard. It provided an exceptionally generous program of stabilization and acted as the guarantor of Greece's membership of the developed world. Although one needs to make the point that in what the recent economic crisis really showed was that the Greeks themselves opted not to make this break. They really want to remain as members of the developed world. Now, to conclude, the realization of these momentous Greek aims took place in the post-war era. The start of rapid economic development met the enormous changes in the structure of the international system, US leadership of the West, European integration, together with the evolution of the Cold War. Greece managed to develop, and Europe and the West went beyond the crude concepts of great power politics, seeking a new international organization. The changes were profound and structural, but it was necessary for both changes to take place, both internal, Greek and international. It took huge efforts to become a member of the European Union and the West. However, these efforts paid off. The 40 years of membership in Europe have clearly shown that EU membership is a guarantee for welfare, development, participation in the European legal civilization, and for Greek democracy. The crisis in the previous decade severely tested Greek loyalties to Europe, but on the other hand, the same period provided for solid proof for the function of European integration, or for the function of Greece's Western identity as a guarantee on many levels. Now, situated in a very dangerous region, today Greece remains within the zone of peace and affluence. But around Greece, Professor Hanson made a reference to the geopolitical situation in the country. Around Greece, from the north through the east and to the south, there is the region of insecurity, the Ukraine, the black hole of the Western Balkans, the huge question mark of contemporary Turkey, and then wars and conflicts in Iraq, Syria, the Arab-Israeli dispute, difficulties in Egypt, collapse in Libya, not to mention the novel dilemmas that the migration flows represent. In these circumstances, there's always the danger that the Greeks may take their happy situation for granted, as many did, in fact, during the previous decade. It would be a grave mistake, of course, and as I have tried to show, the acceptance of Greece as a European, as a Western, rather than as a Near Eastern country, is relatively recent, and therefore it could, under certain conditions, be undone. This is the first and foremost consideration, calling for the good taste and prudence of the Greeks. The second consideration, and I think that this is exactly what we're seeing now with the war in the Ukraine, perhaps the major consideration, involves questions about the necessary evolution, adjustment, and survival of the West and the European Union. At our times, even this cannot be taken for granted, and the Western world needs to protect and expand its union and its processes energetically and effectively. And as I claim, this for Greece is a task of really existential importance. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Evanthis. Thank you very much indeed. That was very thorough. Thank you. Well, I'm adamant that Professor Strauss has lived several lives in the past. I don't know exactly how many, but I definitely know that he fought in the Battle of Salamis on board an Athenian trireme and in the sea battle of Actium on the side of Octavian. This is the reason he can describe these battles so accurately and vividly in his books. He is a brilliant commentator of contemporary issues, and he loved Greece so much that he managed to learn Greek. He's also an honorary citizen of Salamis, no wonder why. Professor Strauss, please take the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Zefiris, for that very, very kind introduction, hardly deserved. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador and distinguished colleagues. It's great to have this opportunity to speak to you today. I don't have nearly the knowledge of modern Greece that my colleagues do, but I will try to bring in perhaps some insights from antiquity. And I want to focus my talk on a man you've all heard of, Themistocles. Themistocles, one of the most famous Athenians of antiquity and the strategist behind Greece's victory in the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC against the Persian Empire. But I think very much a person for our times. As we've heard from our two previous speakers, Greece, for most of its history, and its history goes back 4,000 years, as archaeology tells us. For most of its history, Greece has been a relatively small country, a small society facing larger neighbors, often more dangerous neighbors and often predatory neighbors. And few people, I think, in all of Greek history have dealt with them as successfully as Themistocles did, faced with the challenge of Persian invasion. So he was an Athenian, and he was born maybe around 525 BC and lived to about 460 BC. And he was a member of the political elite, though perhaps not entirely a member of the most influential and famous families. He was one of the most ambitious men of his day, and he was an immensely successful domestic politician, a speaker, a strategist, a soldier, a visionary, and someone who had an enormous armamentarium of tools that he could use to get ahead. Nobody earned better the approval of the historian Thucydides, no easy man to please. And Thucydides said of Themistocles that he was the best judge in a crisis, and he had an unparalleled ability to see the future. He surpassed everybody else in the intuitive ability to meet an emergency. Themistocles was an example of what Clausewitz called coup d'oeil, the ability to see things in the blink of an eye and to decide what to do. Thucydides especially praises his ability in prognosis, his ability to see the future. And Themistocles was proud of the fact that he was a pragmatist and that he wasn't one of the beautiful people. I'll quote what Plutarch says in his Life of Themistocles, talking about the young Themistocles. It came about that in afterlife, at entertainments of a so-called liberal and polite nature, he was forced to defend himself rather rudely, saying that tuning the lyre and handling the harp were no accomplishments of his, but rather taking in hand a city that was small and inglorious and making it glorious and great. So he wasn't elegant and he wasn't polished, but he knew exactly what he wanted to do. He had this ambition and he had this vision of national greatness, and he wasn't going to let anything get in the way of doing it. So in domestic politics, he was a brass-knuckled politician who ostracized his opponents. He was a Democrat. He was a man of the people. He had the common touch. He was the ability to speak to people. We're told that he had a prodigious memory for people's names, and that helped him in politics. He knew what tools to deploy in order to get ahead. So in Athens, that period, winning a tragic competition, financing a trilogy of tragedies that won the first prize was a tool of success, and Themistocles did just that. He also was a master of propaganda and using religion, something that we more often associate with the Romans, but Themistocles was awfully good at this as well. For instance, when faced with the challenge of Persian invasion, he consulted the Delphic oracle, and when he didn't like the answer he got the answer that he liked. He had to go back to them twice, but finally got the answer he wanted. And when he faced opposition from Athenians who didn't want to follow his very painful plan, evacuating the city, he got the priests and priestess of Athena to announce to the city that the snake of Athena was no longer eating the honey cakes that they fed the snake every day, which was the sign to the people that the god was leaving the city. It reminds me of Cavafy's marvelous poem about the god abandoning Antony in a later time. Themistocles was there first. So his political skills, he ostracized his leading opponent, a man named Aristides, and became the top politician in Athens. And he used it to push his agenda. It was partly a personal agenda. He had fought in the Battle of Marathon, the great Athenian victory in 490, but he was jealous, we're told, of the success of Miltiades at the battle and wouldn't rest until he was the first man in Athens. But he also had a sense, a great ability to read the geopolitical realities. While many Athenians thought that their victory at Marathon had saved them from the Persians, Themistocles understood this was not the case at all, and that the Persians were going to come back more dangerously than ever before. He understood that the only way for Athens to defeat the Persians was, first of all, to become a sea power, which was tremendously expensive. Secondly, he came up with a strategy, a really complex strategy that would require the people of Athens to evacuate their country and to move to places around the Saronic Gulf, and particularly to the island of Salamis, in order to lure the Persians into fighting a great battle at Salamis. It really, in terms of poker, this is like playing to an inside straight, extremely difficult thing to do. And there are very few people in history, I think, who have pulled off what Themistocles has pulled off. We've talked about the dichotomy of Greek civilization. And one of the dichotomies that Themistocles represents is the dichotomy between Achilles and Odysseus, between the land warrior and the man of prowess, and the seaman par excellence, Odysseus, the man of many ways, the man of cunning and deception. And Themistocles was a master of deception. He was Machiavellian before Machiavelli, or rather, Machiavelli was Themistoclean. But let me also point out that we want to think of Themistocles as a spider king. There's a marvelous bust outside the city of Rome in Ostia, the port of ancient Rome, was discovered there in the 1930s. It's a Roman copy of a Greek original, and it shows none other than Themistocles. Luckily for us, it has an inscription, so we know it's Themistocles, and it's in the style of the early 5th century BC, the so-called severe style. But if you look at him, the man looks like a bulldog. Zafaris asked me not to have any PowerPoint, so I don't have a PowerPoint. You can Google it. In some ways, he looks like Churchill, but a rougher and tougher Churchill. He's not somebody you wanted to mess with. And that was Themistocles. He really had it all. Anyhow, he convinces the Athenians to build a fleet. He does so in part because Athens has silver mines at Lavrion. There's a lucky strike of silver. Many politicians want to use it basically to distribute payments to the citizenry, an early form of welfare system. Themistocles says, no, we need to use it for guns, not butter. But he also knew that he could not possibly persuade the Athenians to build a fleet against Persia, because Persia just looked too far off. It looks like science fiction, like Star Trek, as my colleague might say. The only way he could get the Athenians to build the fleet, and perhaps also Persia was just too scary, was to tell them they were going to use it against Aegina, Athens' rival in the Saronic Gulf. So that's his way into building the fleet, when he knew perfectly well it'd be used for other purposes. Then, having got what he wanted from the Athenians, so the year is 483, 3 years before the Persian invasion, he then manages to carve out a modicum of unity against a small number of Greek city-states. As Victor said, there are 1,500 Greek city-states, but there are less than 40 that joined the coalition against Persia. That's how few think that this is a doable proposition in order to stop the mighty Persian Empire. So Themistocles then goes on. There are just a couple of things I want to say about what he does in 480 against the Persians. First of all, he is a believer in an active defense. His policy was never to just sit back in Athens and see what's going and defend themselves. Rather, his policy was going out and trying to stop the Persians in central Greece. The more famous Greek initiative, operation in that initiative is, of course, the Spartans at Thermopylae. But at the same time that the Spartans were at Thermopylae, the Athenians were just a few miles away at Artemisium, fighting a naval battle in which they fought the Persians to a draw, which was a magnificent achievement for the new Athenian fleet and gave them tremendous experience. Then, after the Spartan defeat at Thermopylae, Themistocles withdrew the fleet and got the Athenians, much against their will, to evacuate the city of Athens. As I said, most of the civilians went around the Persian Gulf, but the Saronic Gulf, but the fighting men went to the island of Salamis. And I have no doubt there were some Athenian women with them as well. The Greek fleet was based at Salamis. Themistocles was wise enough to realize he couldn't get the leadership of the Greek fleet. That had to go to a Spartan because of Sparta's prestige. And the other Greeks were dead set against fighting in Athens. The Persians invaded Athens. They beached their fleet at Phaleron, and they destroyed the temples on the Acropolis. And the other Greeks on Salamis saw the defeat of the Persians, and they decided to flee back to the Peloponnesus. Then Themistocles carries out a double cross. He sends a slave to the Persians to tell them that Themistocles is ready to betray the Athenian fleet. If they'll only send their fleet into the Salamis Channel that night, they can stop the Greeks from leaving the next morning. And the Persians fall for this trick. But he's also cheating the Greeks. He's not telling them what the Persians are planning to do. And they are trapped there, and they're forced to fight against the Persians the next day, although they had wanted to leave. And of course, the Battle of Salamis turns out to be a smashing success and a total vindication of Themistocles' remarkable plan. Afterwards, after Sparta's victory the next spring at Plataea and Athens' victory at Mycale, Themistocles then proceeds to create an Athenian naval confederacy. And he's the founder of the Athenian Navy. He's one of the great figures in Greek naval history, founder of the Athenian Empire, the brains behind fortifying Athens and fortifying Piraeus, and engages in a number of other Machiavellian tricks in order to make this happen, including tricking his former ally, the Spartans. He doesn't come to a happy end politically. He is ostracized and then accused of treason and forced to flee Greece, where he fetches up no other place in the Persian Empire, and where the Persians, instead of killing him, welcome him and end up making him the governor of Persian territories in Western Anatolia. And he dies outside of Athens, although perhaps his bones were buried by his family secretly in Athens after his death. So I think there's some morals of the story of this very Odyssean leader. If Themistocles were to be in today's world, and we asked him what would be his recipe for success, I think the first thing he would say is that leadership is everything, and that it's important to have a society, it's important to have resources, but you cannot succeed without having the right kind of leader. And so having an educational system that fosters leadership is everything as well. So what does it take to be a great leader a la Themistocles? Well, you want someone who has intelligence, you want someone who has courage, you want someone who has audacity, you want someone who has foresight, you want someone who has cunning, and you want someone who has almost a shameless boldness and is willing to push his agenda no matter what it might take. But you also want someone who has a vision of national greatness and a vision of freedom. And Themistocles is so relevant, first of all, because he had a vision of freedom in both senses of the word. He wanted his country to be autonomous, to be free from foreign rule. But he also believed in democracy, and he believed in political freedom for Athenian citizens. These are all the characteristics that I think he would say would take to be a great leader. What else would he say that it would take to be a great leader, and what is necessary in the world today? Communication skills, the skills to give one's message out clearly and effectively, and to defend one's agenda, and when necessary, to use cunning and deception to win in domestic politics. I've often thought that there's a real affinity between Thucydides and Sun Tzu. And I'll tell you an anecdote. One of the best students I've had in recent years is Chinese, and he's a child of the Chinese elite. He studied Greek history with me. And he said to me, you know, I really think the greatest leader in all of ancient Greece is Themistocles, because nobody else achieved what Sun Tzu, so clearly achieved what Sun Tzu thought was the absolute acme of the military art, which is to set up the enemy in a position so that you've practically won the battle before it's begun. What Sun Tzu refers to as shi, and which means translated as something like strategic advantage or dynamic potential. So you need a leader who can do all of that, who can also prepare his society, which today would mean rearming appropriately. I note that Greece has done considerable rearming in recent years, and now Germany has, to everyone's surprise, announced under its socialist prime minister that it will double the military budget. We're waiting for the United States to recognize the importance of rearmament in the contemporary world. You also need to unite the allies abroad, which Themistocles did so well. You need to prepare yourself for the war of the future. It seems to me that, of course, we should be preparing ourselves for what China might do vis-a-vis Taiwan, now that we've seen what's happened in Ukraine. But we also should be preparing ourselves for biological warfare. We've already gotten a foretaste of biological warfare with COVID. And even if COVID was an accident, it was certainly not an accident that it was spread abroad. And we've seen what how much damage a relatively mild virus can do. Finally, you need a leader who is able to take advantage of opportunity. And if there wasn't ever an opportunity for Greece, it seems to me to be now. This is the moment for Greece to be pushing, and for its friends to be pushing, the idea of the Eastern Mediterranean pipeline. I think that even the most convinced climatologist has to recognize that the West has very serious needs, energy needs right now, and that it's extremely dangerous for the West to be relying on Russian energy when there are other sources, or for the United States to be looking to get energy from Venezuela, of all places, and from Saudi Arabia. The Saudis have their own bone to pick with the US administration, and not be willing to get energy from Canada, a friendly country, or from Greece, Israel, and Cyprus in the Eastern Mediterranean pipeline. So I think Themistocles would say that the moment is now, and now is the time to push this agenda. In any case, I hope that he is a useful, if not an inspirational model of what a leader can achieve in a democracy, a leader who has what it takes in terms of leadership. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Barry, thank you so very much indeed. It was fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Professor David Berkey is the 21st century version of the American Philhellenes of the Greek War of Independence, I might say. He is the scholar who carried their legacy to the modern day by publishing on Makrianis and other leading personalities of the Greek Revolution. Professor Berkey studied at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, and since then, he takes his students to a summer tour in Greece every year. Beyond this, Professor Berkey is the person that helps Hoover Institution run so efficiently. David, you have the floor.
Thank you, Zafiris. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. It's an honor for me to participate in today's conference celebrating Greek history from antiquity to the present. And unlike Barry, I did not heed your request to avoid PowerPoint, so I'm going to share my screen with you and include a PowerPoint presentation. Hopefully you can see this. I selected the topic of my presentation for several reasons. First, as a research fellow at the Hoover Institution, I wanted to share some of the remarkable materials housed in our library and archives that pertain to Greek history. Second, several of these collections directly relate to the work of the United Nations in Greece following World War II. And third, I believe that we can make relevant observations about the challenges of facilitating relief efforts in general, based upon the specific conditions of war-torn Greece and the experiences of the Greek people described by the sources in the Hoover archives. Let's begin with a brief historical overview and some statistics of the economic and humanitarian crisis in Greece at the end of World War II. Greece entered World War II on October 28, 1940, when Italian forces invaded northern Greece from Albania. Greek defense forces successfully repulsed the Italians, and it was not until the following April, when Germany invaded, that the Axis occupied the country and partitioned Greece into zones controlled by Germany, Italy, and Bulgaria. The occupation resulted in years of famine, starvation, and countless atrocities. When Allied forces drove out the Germans in 1944, the country was in ruins. The following statistics, as reported by Amika Nachmani, are illustrative of the calamitous state of Greece at the end of the war. Deforestation in various areas of 75% of the country's forests. 400,000 buildings destroyed or severely damaged. 2,000 villages leveled. No industry or communications network to speak of. Trade in either imports or exports non-existent, coupled with the loss of 3/4 of its merchant fleet, and hyperinflation to ludicrous levels of exchange for the worthless drachma. Destruction was not spread evenly through the country. In some areas, Athens in particular, fared better than others. Regardless, no part of the country was unaffected because of internal migration. To these statistics, the restricted economic report that the American Embassy prepared for a visiting congressional delegation and dated September 19, 1947, provides further detail of the bleak condition of the Greek economy. Quote, "These aspects of the Greek situation indicate what Greece's own efforts, combined with substantial foreign aid, have been able to accomplish in the 2 years since the war ended. despite the fear and lack of confidence engendered by the threat on her northern borders and the fifth column at work within the country. They can be considered encouraging, however, only in relation to the extreme depths to which the country and economy fell at the end of the war. In terms of recovery to normal productivity and to the relatively low pre-war standard of living, little more than half of the recovery job has been accomplished. Much of the progress, furthermore, has been achieved only recently, and the full effects of increased productivity have still to be felt in other sections of the economy. Rather than marking the end of its struggles, Greece still had to contend with a violent civil war being fought by factions which competed for control of the country's governance. Analyzing the complexities of the Greek civil war beyond the scope of the present talk, however, foreign relief efforts in Greece were an integral part of the war's duration, intensity, and outcome, and as such cannot be ignored. Already by 1943, competing factions appeared in Greece, at first with the communist-supported National Liberation Front, EAM, and its military wing, the National People's Liberation Army, ELAS, against the British-backed National Republican Greek League, EDES. As World War II reached its conclusion, a coalition government was formed that comprised the competing factions. Fearing the rising strength of communist elements, the British helped the National Republican Greek League to dismantle the National Liberation Front. The Varkiza Agreement of February 12, 1945, granted amnesty to communist forces, an end to martial law, and a promise to purge the civil service of those Greeks who had collaborated with the Germans in exchange for the surrender of their weapons and the release of their hostages. Neither side, however, abided by the agreement, and a new round of hostilities commenced. By December 1946, the former elements of ELAS reconstituted themselves as the Greek Democratic Army, the GDA, under the direction of the Greek Communist Party, the KKE. Prior to this development, elections on March 31st, 1946 were held under the supervision of US, British, and French observers and resulted in a pro-royalist parliamentary majority, and later that year, the restoration of the Greek monarch George II in a plebiscite. Communist forces were successful in regaining control over large sections of the country. The entrance of the United States in March 1947 under the mandate of the Truman Doctrine supplanted the role of British forces and culminated in 1947 with an end to the Civil War and the defeat of communism. The Hoover materials pertaining to this tumultuous period of Greek history reveal different elements of both the conflicts and the efforts to rebuild the country. Furthermore, these varied accounts are those of scholars, military intelligence officials, government representatives, and aid workers. As we shall see, certain common themes emerge across this diverse spectrum of views. Harold Vanderbilt, a prominent Greek-American businessman, founded the Greek War Relief Association during World War II to help alleviate the starvation of the Greek people during the years of famine. The Hoover Institution has collected reports and other documents related to the group's work. Here are some posters advertising the organization and seeking financial contributions from the American people in support of the GWRA. The prominent archaeologist Oscar Brunier returned to Greece after World War II on a mission with the International Red Cross. In a sound recording housed in the Hoover archives titled "Greece as I Saw It," Brunier described conditions in Greece to encourage listeners to support the work of the Greek War Relief Association. Brunier contrasted the vastly greater resources of UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Association, and its expenditures on major infrastructure projects with the smaller, more focused work of the GWRA. Quote, "Our first stop was Athens. On the surface, at least, it is still the beautiful, lighthearted city that I knew before the war. Material damage has been slight, and the crowded public square where Athenians gathered to sing and discuss politics, as they always did, gives one the impression that Athens is completely unchanged. But in the faces of friends aged beyond their years, I saw the frightful toll that the war had taken in broken homes, privation, unemployment, and fear. That Greece will be rehabilitated is beyond question. Devastated as she is by war and occupation, Greece retains one priceless asset, the spirit of a people. The Greeks were crushed, but not defeated by Axis terrorism. They are crushed, but not defeated by the problems of Reconstruction. Everywhere in Greece, one senses an eagerness to forget the troubles of the past and to apply every effort to aid the business of rebuilding. If even a modicum of the material means of rehabilitation are supplied, I have the utmost confidence that Greece will be one of the first of the liberated countries to regain the stability which will enable her to play a contributing role in the world of tomorrow. Also, in the Hoover Institution archives is the personal diary of Hugh Gibson. In the spring of 1946, President Harry Truman asked the former US President Herbert Hoover to undertake a worldwide tour as the head of the US President's Famine Emergency Committee, or Food Mission, to grapple with global famine in the wake of the World War. Hoover was the perfect choice for such a job given his work to alleviate hunger in Europe after World War I. Gibson accompanied Hoover on this trip that logged over 50,000 miles and kept a detailed log of meetings and observations of the places they visited. The entry for Athens on April 17, 1946 contains details about Archbishop Damaskinos, Prime Minister Panagiotis Poulitsis, future Prime Minister Dimitrios Maximos, ministers of agriculture and of the national economy. Gibson visited the Acropolis, an Orthodox church service where he, quote, would have stayed longer if there had been a chair, unquote, and life in Athens under British occupation versus that of the Nazis. Towards the end, he writes the following, quote, people kept gathering around me to thank me for having broken the blockade and saving them from utter starvation. The more I disowned this, the less they believed me. Finally, one disappeared for a few minutes and came back to say that Hoover had confirmed the report. I gave up and resigned myself to being the savior of Greece. The net impression we gather here is one of complete and hopeless ruin. The railroads are destroyed, rolling stock removed, bridges blown up, merchant and fishing fleets gone, livestock and farm tools stolen. It is hard to see where they begin. Other Americans had already begun to address this conundrum with direct aid to the people who were most in need. The papers of Anna Hayward Lyle, which are housed in the Hoover archives, tell the remarkable story of an aid worker on the front lines of relief work. In a letter home to her mother dated September 20th, 1945, she writes, there is no question about the fact that we are needed here or that we are accomplishing something. It may not be as efficient or as smooth running as one would like, and it's only scratching the surface as yet. But we are keeping them alive thanks to the sacrifices you all have been making in food and clothes. The UNRWA ration isn't enough, but it's all they have to eat. I must say I don't look forward to this winter. There's going to be terrible suffering, I'm afraid. I dread most the bare feet. The more we do, the more we realize the enormity of the job. It will be nice to be working on a smaller, more concrete job instead of in this enormous, large-scale organization. But there's no doubt about it. When you have to save a whole country and people, not to say continent, almost half world, you have to have the huge organization with all the red tape and bureaucracy that goes with it. I hope some of the big top executive administrators who did such a good job in organizing the war production, distribution, etc., will feel like coming to lend us a hand. Hayward continued her work in Greece for the Near East Foundation, providing much needed assistance to sick and malnourished children. Funded with private donations, the Near East Foundation served villages in northern and central Greece beyond the reach of larger organizations, which concentrated their assistance in the major population centers. The Near East Foundation focused on restoring the health of those most in need and bringing dignity to a suffering people. Hayward's letters reveal her generous and caring nature and seemed far removed from cynical attempts to brand American aid as self-interested and imperialistic. Here are photographs from Zakynthos showing children upon arrival at the camp before receiving their new clothes and scratching their heads due to scabies. The photograph on the right shows the children after being properly cleaned, clothed, and fed. Lyle comments that they are still awaiting shoes. Of course, Greece's strategic location in southern Europe and the Mediterranean made it a place of vital interest to the Allies in World War II and the United States at the start of the Cold War. Preventing the spread of communism within Greece and keeping it out of the Soviet sphere of influence were important elements of US foreign policy. For this reason, the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, enlisted Kostas Kouvaras, codenamed Pericles, to report on the activities of EAM in German-occupied Greece. Kouvaras produced detailed accounts for OSS that cover a range of economic, societal, and political topics. Copies of his transmitted reports are held in the Hoover archives. In a missive dated June 1st, 1944, he writes, quote, "You will be doing a real service to humanity if you bring some people to realize the importance for American help to Greece and the possibility of doing such a thing. It will be the easiest thing to distribute money here because every village has a self-government organization, and the only thing to be done is to give the money to the organization which is elected by the villagers themselves and knows the conditions of every family. As far as getting money into the country, you know that gold sovereigns are heavy and can be dropped from a plane." The United Nations Special Committee on the Balkans was founded in November 1947 and lasted until December 1951 with the stated mission, quote, "to perform good offices and to help settle disputes." The Hoover Institution possesses the personal photographic album of US Navy Commander George S. Sherbetoff, who was the assistant to the Commission's US representative, Admiral Alan G. Kirk. On December 17th, 1941, a party of UNSCOB delegates, accompanied by members of the UN Secretariat and Greek liaison officers, went by train to Morias, station near the Yugoslav-Greek border, to observe guerrilla activities. 2.5 years after the end of World War II, Sherbetoff's photographs document the continued difficulties facing the Greek people, in particular the plight of refugees fleeing the dangerous borderlands and hundreds of displaced children. All of the featured Hoover Institution archival documents and photographs portray a country in desperate need of assistance. The physical destruction left in the wake of the Axis retreat from Greece, starvation, and the resulting loss of life challenged the spirits of the Greek people. Americans in Greece during these years sought to aid the reconstruction of the country, restore the well-being of its people, and also bring about economic and political stability. It should not surprise us that this was in part motivated to advance American interests in the emerging Cold War period. As I read through these assorted diaries and reports, I was struck that many of the sources, while acknowledging the need for reconstruction and the financial requirements to achieve it, saw the psychological trauma of war and occupation as the greatest impediment for the Greeks to overcome. It is impossible not to admire the resilience of the Greek people and wonder at their many achievements. Yes, certainly from antiquity, but perhaps even more so today. Thank you.
David, thank you so very much indeed. Thank you. Now, Professor Hatzivassiliou will close the conference with a few remarks. Evanthi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Zafiri. I'll try to be very brief so that we may have some opportunity for discussion. We all spoke about the relation between geography, history, and intellectual developments, which is almost inevitable when discussing Greece, either in the Antiquity, Middle Ages, or in the modern period. I always say to my students that as a historian, I very much like to study interesting epochs, but I never intended to live in one of them. And yet we cannot avoid this thing. I mean, it is impossible to have an easy period in world history. We had one after the end of the Cold War, but it seems to be over now. And there is a kind of a problem. Greece's area is always interesting. It's a crossroads. I mean, I think that all four of us spoke about this. Professor Hanson, most of all, spoke about this Greek ambiguity, that it looks both east and west. And it is a constant burden in Greek history. It's also opportunity. I mean, if there was something that allowed the Greeks to be creative from the start, from the 8th century BC, I mean, it was this ability to take different elements from different places around them and to combine them. Professor Strauss spoke to us about a very novel, and he gave us a very novel insight of Themistocles, not so much as a strategist, but as an intellectual of international relations. It is very relevant for our world today. I mean, we have not gone beyond the fundamental principles of international relations, of international contact, principles, after all, that have been laid down in Mesopotamia some 5,000 years ago. And Professor Strauss showed that we must be able to think like that, to enjoy our democracy and affluence, and democracy needs to be protected. And sometimes in our affluence in the past decades, we in the West seem to be kind of ready to forget this. And Professor Berkey, I mean, he spoke to us. I mean, he gave us a picture of the devastation of Greece after the Second World War, but he also mentioned this glorious American humanitarianism, the philanthropism that has been shown not only after the Second World War, but I have studied the efforts of the American Red Cross after the First World War, especially in northeastern Greece, which was under Bulgarian occupation then. And of course, this year is the 100th anniversary of the Asia Minor disaster, and I think it is a kind of duty for Greece, for the Greek state, for the Greek people, to remember the glorious assistance that American organizations have given to this country in order to house and protect, in order to allow thousands of people to survive. In the end of the day, in my view, this solidarity, this humanitarian action, in my view, is one of the most important things that tie Greece to the United States and to the West. It was a very practical manifestation of common values, for which I must say I'm really grateful to these people. I mean, professors. Oscar Brunier was a major intellectual, major academic. Carl Blegen, one of the greatest archaeologists of the world, was actually went to Greek Eastern Macedonia and was distributing bread. A typhus epidemic broke out, and they did not withdraw. Some of them fell in. One of them died. I mean, world famous, people who would become world famous academics, archaeologists, historians who left their jobs and fell into this troubled area, feeling the impositions of humanitarian values. I think that it was a very nice evening. It allowed us to think way back to the ancient world and to see how relevant, in the end of the day, is the ancient world to our world today. And I think that this is the remark with which I will end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Evanthis. Since I see there are no questions from the attendees, I would like to thank from the depths of my heart Professor Hanson, Professor Hatzivassiliou, Professor Strauss, Professor Berkey, all the people who attended this conference, and of course, and by all means, last but in no way least, my boss, Ambassador Panagiotis Tournaris, who trusted me, and he gave me a carte blanche to make this conference. But above all, Victor, Evanthis, Barry, and David, thank you so very much. I am really in debt to you. Thank you. Have a nice day and have a nice evening accordingly. And thank you very much for all the people who attended this conference. I promise there will be a sequel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.